In this video, we're going to talk about using IIS on Windows as a reverse proxy sitting in front of your DB Sign server and as an endpoint for TLS authentication for client certificates. Now, the diagram you see right now is just an example of what your network might look like in your environment. I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail right now. You can go watch the Apache proxy video that we put out, and I talk about this in more detail. But right now, basically, all you need to know is that in this example, the proxy server that you see here is going to be IIS. And then, of course, DB Sign is running on Tomcat, and we've got our database on the backside in SQL Server. Now, this diagram has all of that on different servers, but in our example, and just for simplicity, it's all on the same computer. So we've got IIS, Tomcat, and our database all on the same host. So first we're going to look at setting up the application request routing or the proxy things in IIS, and then we will look at turning on TLS in IIS and enabling client authentication with their certificates. Okay, first, let's talk about using IIS as a reverse proxy for the outside to be able to access our DB Sign server deployed in Tomcat. Now, the reason we want to do that is because we have DB Sign running on this machine, and it's on port 8080. And that's perfectly fine, but we probably don't want to open up any other ports, more ports than we need to. So we don't want to open up port 8080, and we already have a web server here on this server. And it's running IIS. But if we try to go to DB Sign/server here, we're going to get a 404 from IIS because, of course, it doesn't know anything about DB Sign/server right now. So let's go fix that. Let's open up the IIS manager, and we're going to configure application request routing, ARR. Now, ARR is not enabled by default on IIS. I've already got it installed, and you can install it through the Web Platform Components installer. So there's all kinds of documentation how to do that. You can go look for it. It's very easy to install. But once you get it installed, there's a couple of things we need to do. So first, we're just going to click on the server name here, and you'll see Application Request Routing Cache is one of the options over here. So we'll open that up. And over here on the Actions pane, let's click on Server Proxy Settings. And first thing, we need to enable this as a proxy. So we're just going to click that Enable Proxy button and hit Apply, and we are done with that. Now if we go down to our sites, and we're running off of the default website here. So we're going to choose that one, and we're going to add a new URL rewrite rule. So let's go in there, and we're going to add a new rule over here in the Actions pane. And we want to do a blank rule, and we'll just call this DB Sign. And we're going to, for requested URL, we're going to make sure it matches some pattern, and we're using a regular expression. And the pattern is going to look something like this. So we want anything that starts with DB Sign, followed by a slash, it's going to look something like that. And let's test this pattern. Let's make sure it works. So DB Sign/server. All right, looks good. The input matches the pattern. And then we go down here, and now we need to tell it what URL it's going to rewrite to, where it's going to route the request. So let's go to http:/, and this is our Tomcat installation, 8080 DB Sign / and we need to pick a specific component out of the regular expression match. And you don't have to understand what all this means. Just put it in exactly like I have it here. And that should be it. Append query string, ignore case, and let's hit apply. So now that should be working. So let's go back into our browser here, and that easy. So now we have Apache running as a proxy server to Tomcat. Now, I do want to mention one thing here. We talked about the concept of privileged requests in the previous video about installing, and there was a request called show stats, and we just happened to make it privileged. And one of the reasons we made it privileged is because it reveals a lot of information about your server, software versions, and things like that. And so we didn't want it accessible from the outside world, so we changed it to only accept requests from localhost. But now there's a problem, because this is a reverse proxy and all of this information is going through IIS, and IIS is making a new connection to Tomcat on localhost. Every request that comes in through IIS looks like it's coming from localhost. So if I go to show stats, I'm going to get it, and I'm going to get it anywhere where I can access this URL. So let's change a little bit of something about our rule here. So what if instead of localhost, what if we went at this from the actual IP address of the server? And this is 192.168.252.151. And what happens now? We get a blank screen. And let's see why we get a blank screen. Let's open up the developer tools. And let's go to the network tab. And what we actually get is a 403, which is access denied. And that's what we should get, because now these requests, because we're coming at it from the external IP, it doesn't look like it's coming from localhost. Now, this could still create a problem if this proxy server was on a server you wanted to be privileged. So there's a lot of different ways to work around this, and it's something that we would work with you individually on a per site basis, just to make sure that this proxy is set up in a way that you don't reveal privileged requests to the outside world. So we've got IIS set up now with as the reverse proxy, and so in the sections to come, we're going to look at enabling TLS on this server and then certificate client authentication. Right now on this server, IIS is only running on port 80. It's only doing HTTP. And so if we tried to do HTTPS, it would just sit and spin until it finally timed out, because we don't have HTTPS working here. So let's go and let's do that. So for our default website, we want to click on our default website here, and we want to click on the bindings setting in our actions tab. And this is where we'll enable HTTPS over port 443. So let's add, and it's going to be HTTPS, and it's going to be on port 443, and we have to select a certificate. But if we drop this down, we don't have any. If we go to select, we don't have any certificates. So let's remedy that. I've got the certificate that we're going to use, my TLS certificate that I have from our internal PKI, and you're probably going to have one from your own PKI to use with your web server. So let's import that into the proper place. So I'm going to open up a management console and file, add, remove, snap in. And we're going to choose certificates. and add. Now, I have some options right here, and I don't want to import this as the current user that's logged in or even as a service account. This certificate is going to need to go in the computer account stores. So choose computer account, and we want it from the local computer, and okay. And so if we go in here and we look under the personal tab, this is where the certificate is going to go. We don't have any in here yet. So let's import all tasks and import. And I'm going to browse to where I have my P12 file for this, for TLS. So mine is right here. And next, and it's asking me for the P12 password. We're going to place it in the personal store and finish. Import was successful. And there it is. And again, you can see the key on the icon here, meaning I have the private key for that certificate. The root and the intermediate were in the P12, so they got imported as well. We could leave them, but just to clean things up, I'm going to delete those. Now, while I'm in here, I want to talk about something else too. In the previous video on installation, we talked a lot about trusted certificates and intermediate certificates, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But for Windows and for IIS, when we start to do client authentication, your client certificates are going to need to be from a trusted PKI, from a trusted root. And so whoever you are expecting client certificates to come from, the root CA needs to be in here. Ours that we're going to be using are from the DBSign test PKI. So I have my root here. If you're in DoD or something like that, you're going to want to make sure your roots are in the Trusted Root Certification Authority in the local computer store. At the same time, you're going to want to make sure that in the intermediate certificate authorities that all of your intermediates are listed here as well. And mine is, there's just one. In your environment, you may have dozens. You may only have one, but mine's there. So we have our TLS certificate, we have the roots, and we have the intermediates that we need all in the right places. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And let's go back into the IIS Manager. And let's drill all the way back down to our website, and let's go back to the bindings setting under actions. So now we should be able to add an HTTPS. Just for my purposes, I only want this to listen on my external IP, so I'm going to choose that. And then my host name is dbsdemo-win.gradcalinternal.com. Of course, your host name will be whatever your host name is, and it needs to match what's on your TLS certificate. And now I've got my certificate that I'm going to use because I've imported it. So we're going to close that. We have both bindings. And just for grins, let's go ahead and restart the website. And let's go back over here now and see if we're listening on HTTPS. And we are. And let's go take a look at the certificate. View certificate. And this is the right one. I can see my host name there matches what's in the subject alt name and in the common name for this cert. So we're good to go. And we have IIS set up for TLS. Now what we're going to do next is configure it such that when we come to something at /dbsign, it's going to require us to provide a client certificate from our machine. Now let's talk about TLS authentication and signing with client certificates. Now, if your end users are not going to have certificates and all of your signing requests are going to be coming from your back end, this video basically isn't really doing much for you. The whole purpose here is to open things up so that end users can make requests against your DBSign server to sign with the certificate they have on their computer, whether it's imported into their browser or it's in a smart card or some kind of other token. so that those signatures can be generated and contain information about the user from their certificate and a strong authentication mechanism like TLS authentication. And so if we just open up our browser and make a request here, and the requests that we made when we were testing looked a lot like this, but we were doing a different type of signature. But here we're doing an app sign SAS, and you'll see SAS in a lot of different places on our in our documentation. You'll also see the word derived signatures, but anytime you see SAS, which stands for separately authenticated signatures, and derived signatures, it means the same thing. It's this process of authenticating a user and then supplying that information to the DB-Sign server to become part of the digital signature. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can authenticate the user yourself and give us a username or user ID, something like that, or you can use some other mechanism like TLS authentication to do a strong authentication against a user certificate, and we use that certificate to generate the signature. So here we're doing a SAS request, and we're telling it that we're going to be using a certificate, and then the data to be signed is just hello. So we'll send that off to the server, but the first thing we get back is request not permitted. And if you remember from the previous installation video, DB-Sign rejects all requests by default. So we have to go in and configure a couple of things to make it allow this request to even happen. So we're going to open up the config editor and open up our server's config file. And if you remember, the server's config file is in the Tomcat installation directory, web apps, DB-Sign. This is where DB-Sign is deployed, and it's under webinf and dbsign.cfg. And this is the config file that we've been using all this time to do several different things. So let's go down to our default instance, and first we're going to scroll down to our request security. There's a couple of things we want to do here. First is this checkbox right here. Now, in your environment, in a real production environment, we want to keep this checked because we only want post requests to be able to come in. We don't want to be able to do GET requests, but we're doing a GET request from the browser URL for testing, so we're going to uncheck that box right there. And then we're going to look down at all these different kinds of requests, and remember we put app server signed to privileged, but now we want to look at app signed SAS. Remember, that's the type of request we're making up here in our parameters for our request. So app signed SAS, we're going to make this one public. So because of the nature of this request, and they may be coming from, they could be coming from anywhere on the internet or from within your network, but we want to open it up a little bit more than what we want our privileged requests. So we're going to set this to public. And so that takes care of that request. But then we need to scroll down a little bit more and go to the derived signatures section. And this feature is disabled by default, so we want to enable it. And just like privileged requests, we can narrow down where we want signing requests to come from. But here for our example, we're going to open it up just to all IPv4 addresses. This could just be your network. If you're only having machines signed from a handful of different places, you can put it there. It may be that you can have a single computer in here, which happens to be your proxy server, just depending on how things are set up and what requests look like when they finally get back to the DB-Sign server. Now, I mentioned that we can do this with certificates, or we can do it with a user ID. We're not worried about user ID right now. We have another video about implementing user ID in a test application. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, go and check out that video. But right here, we're only interested in certificates. And so we want to permit certs. And we can get the cert in one of three different ways, either by a request attribute, a request header, or in a request parameter, like a post parameter or up on the query string for a GET. The way we're set up with IIS and ARR Proxy, we're going to be getting this in a header. not an attribute. I talked a little bit more about attributes. Again, if you want to go back and watch the Apache TLS video, and I talk in more detail about the difference between attribute and header and when you may use one over another. But in this instance on IIS with ARR, it's going to be coming to us through a header. And right down here, we have a list of headers that we're going to look in. Now, we ship with 2 headers set. ARR is going to send the request by a header called XARR client cert, and that's going to be the base 64 encoded certificate, user certificate. SSL client cert is kind of the de facto name for the request header that is sent by Apache if you're using mod proxy HTTP. So those are kind of the ones that we always run into. Your header can be whatever name you want it to be, but I just know in this example, I know this is what the header name is going to be. So I don't need to worry about changing this. So I can save my config file now, and we can go and restart Apache. And now that we've got all the requests enabled and permitted and the mechanism by which we're going to get the user certificate defined, again, in this case, it's going to be a header, the DB-Sign server is going to be able to take the certificate that was used during the TLS authentication step, and it's going to be forwarded to the DB-Sign server, and the server will use that and as a means by which to tie the user to the signed data, and all that's going to be bundled inside of the signature that gets generated. So we'll just wait for Tomcat to restart here, and once it restarts, we'll be able to retry this request. And hopefully it won't take too much longer. All right, now it's starting back up. So if we go back over here now and retry this request, the first time, if you remember, request was not permitted. But now I get a different error message. I get an error message that says SAS cert could not be determined. Now, this could be caused by any number of different things. Maybe we've got our header name wrong. Maybe we're trying to use an attribute instead of a header and we're looking for a header, or vice versa. But the problem is here, we're accessing the site over TLS, but we're not doing client authentication, so there's not any cert to actually find. So let's go and fix that in IIS. So we're going to open up the IIS manager, and we're going to go to our website. Now, under default website, there's nothing here right now. This is just a stock installation of IIS, and there's not any web application deployed here. But we could go to SSL settings right here for the website, and we could say require SSL and then require client certs. Now, what that would do is that would do it globally for your whole web server. So anything that your web server serves, your host application, anything, is going to require a client certificate. Now, that may be what you want to do. That may not be what you want to do. So we're going to, in this example, we're going to say that we don't want everything on our web server to have to require a certificate, only the DB-Sign stuff. But I don't have a way to do that here because this is website wide. So I'm going to trick IIS just a little bit. And I'm going to go to where the website files are deployed, my HTTP route. And this is just stock IIS stuff. And I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call it DB-Sign. And if I go back over here now and refresh, now I have a DB-Sign folder. Now, you may be saying, well, that's fine, but now won't you just be served an empty folder instead of your DB-Sign request? Well, when we did the request routing proxy settings, that information gets processed before IIS will serve anything out of this folder. So before we get anything out of dbSign, out of this folder we just created, the ARR rule is going to have already kicked in and funneled the request over to Tomcat. So nothing in this folder is going to get served because of the way we have things set up. But if we have this folder and we set SSL settings, require SSL, and require a certificate, this rule will be enforced before the ARR rules. So IIS is going to see something coming in for /dbSign. It's going to require a client certificate because of these settings we just did, and then, assuming that that authentication request happens properly, it's going to forward the request over to Tomcat. So let's see what that looks like now. Now we get prompted for a certificate, and let's choose one of our certificates. So let's hit OK. And now we have a successful signature, and here's the signature right here, generated from a TLS authentication, and this signature has all the user information and all that built into it. So on Windows with IIS, this is how you set up your proxy server and how you enable TLS and mutual client authentication to use their certificates to sign with in dbSign. So finally, to wrap things up, I want to make a few little tweaks in IIS with regard to client certificate checking. Now, these are not required. You don't have to do these last couple of steps, but it's recommended, just kind of best practices for dbSign. And the first one we want to do here in the IIS Manager is drill all the way down to this dbSign folder that we created earlier. And what we want to do is, for this directory and this directory alone, is disable KeepAlives. Now, KeepAlives in general are a great feature because it allows you on your client side to keep a connection open and reuse it for your web server. It's performance enhancements. But for the dbSign folder, what we want to try to do is to force the client computer to make a new connection every time it goes to that directory, because we want the user's private key exercised every time. And so anything that we can do to try to force the client to create a new connection to it each time, we want to try to do that. And disabling KeepAlives is one way that we can do that. So here in your IIS Manager, drill all the way down to that dbSign folder that we created and click it. And then you're going to find the HTTP response headers option over here, and we're going to double click that to open it. And over under the Actions pane, find Set Common Headers and click it. And you'll see that Enable HTTP KeepAlive is checked by default. We're just going to uncheck that and tell it OK. And then that should take effect, and that should be good. So we're finished here in the IIS Manager. The next thing we're going to do is a feature in the TLS spec that allows us to send a list of the issuing certificates, issuing intermediate certificates that we want to prefer, so that the client has a list to go by to narrow down the certificate selection on the user. For example, you may have 5 or 6 certificates on your client machine for different purposes, for different organizations, or just for different things. And if we don't send down this list with our HTTP request during the handshake, if we don't send this down from the server, your user may be prompted with all of those certificates. But let's say that we can, from the server side, tell the client we only want to deal with intermediates X, Y, and Z. Well, we can add those into our configuration and send down those certificate names so that the client can narrow down that prompt a little bit and help the users out a little bit. So that's what we're going to do here. And so I've got a management console opened. back to the same place where we imported our TLS certificate earlier in the video. This is the local computer certificate store. Again, not the local user or a service account. This is the local computer certificate store. If we click on personal, we'll see our SSL certificate in here. And remember, we have all of our trusted roots and intermediate certificate authorities, all of that. But what we're interested in right now is the client authentication issuers. And we want to add into here one by one each of the intermediate CAs that we want our clients to prefer when they start prompting. So we're going to right click on the certificate client authentication issuers, and we're going to import a certificate. And we just got to do these one by one. And here, if you'll remember, we only have the one intermediate CA, so DB sign test CA1, and that's the only one that we can add in here. If you have others, you need to add them all in here. So for example, in the DoD PKI, again, you're going to have dozens of intermediate certificates in here, and this is the intermediates, not the roots. So we've got this done here on our machine, and we're pretty much done and set up on Windows and IIS with TLS authentication. And so that's it for this video. Please let us know if you have any questions. Subscribe so you know when we put out new videos, and we will see you later.